I'm privileged to be sitting here with Norm Katz. My name is Sharon Alterman, and we are interviewing Norman for our oral history project. Do we have your permission to use the subject of this interview for the historic record?
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
It's a privilege to be here with you, and you've had
Thank
such
you.
a long career within our community. And so let's start at the very beginning. We'd like to know about your family. Tell us about your parents.
My father, both of them were immigrants. My father was born in Sandomierz, Poland. It was then part of Tsarist Russia. And my mother was born in David Horodok, which is now in Belarus, but it's a Russian area. They both came to America. My mother came in 1914, and it's a very interesting story how she got here. And my father came in 1913. I think I've been closer to my mother's family throughout my life. My mother was the second of 5 children. I had 3, she was the second. She had an older sister and 3 younger brothers, the Schechters. The older sister was married to Philip Eisenstadt. Philip Shoes was the name of his business. My mother, what had happened is I am named after my grandfather, my mother's father. He had suffered a stroke in 1910, and he was incapacitated to a large extent. So they decided to migrate, fortunately, to America. I guess this is the only time that a stroke really was a lifesaver. At any rate, they sent my oldest aunt, my mother's older sister, to America, and she worked in a sweatshop in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. And she saved up a lot of money for those days, and she sent my mother a ship card. My mother got the ship card, and I assume she was taken to the railhead, which was maybe 5-10 miles away, by horse and wagon. She got on the train. I do not know if she was alone or she was with other immigrants. I don't remember. I don't know that part of the story. But she got to Warsaw, and from Warsaw she was supposed to go by train to Hamburg, get on a British ship and come to the United States, getting in at Ellis Island. When she got to Warsaw, she then hooked up with, I know, with a lot of other immigrants. I don't know if there were 40 or 140, I just don't know. But she couldn't go to Hamburg. The Archduke had been assassinated in Sarajevo. She was traveling all alone. She was 17 at the time, or 16. And Kleinstädtel, as they said, she was a small-town girl. She didn't have a big education, although she was very intelligent. And fortunately, she had a good ship agent. And the ship agent took all these immigrants, I don't know how many there were, and he took them behind the Russian lines. And she got to, I think, Riga. And then she got on a ship. She told me she thought the ship went to Sweden. Never was in Sweden. It went to England. She got to Liverpool because I found her records at Ellis Island, and it said that she was born in 1898. She always said she was born in 1899. I wanted to be younger. But at any rate, she hooked up with a lady who was traveling with 3 children, she told me. And it's a very touching story. She got to the United States, and somehow or other she got separated from this lady. And she said she felt like a motherless child. But she cleared the immigration. They used to check your eyes for glaucoma, I think it was. She passed it, but she didn't know how to get to her sister. And she told me she was really petrified. She didn't know how to get to her sister. And some man went through. I have to tell you, my mother was a rather good-looking girl. And she was out past the gate, so she was legally in the United States. That's all you had to do was get through the gate. And some man came through and was yelling out in Yiddish, "Does anybody need any help?" And she didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know a word about it. And she was very worried, and she finally said, "I've got to find out what to do." And he speaks Yiddish. So she went over to him, and it turned out he was from Hayas. And he took her to the train station in Manhattan, sent a telegram to my aunt to meet her at the train station in Boston, and told the conductor where to get her off, told her where to get off in Boston and all that. And I have to tell you that to this day, I make a small donation to HIAS in memory of that event. I was very touched by it. She finally hooked up with her sister, and then her 3 younger brothers and her mother came to America. Her mother was the only grandparent that I really knew. Mm-hmm. My father's father was a little bit different. But at any rate, that's my mother's family. And they were living in Boston, and then with her sister. And then there were jobs in Detroit, because Detroit was, again, like the arsenal of democracy in the First World War. And she was attracted to come to Detroit. That's where she met my father. My father was born in Sandomierz, Poland, which was right on the Vistula River. And that was the border between Austro-Hungary on the other side of the river and Tsarist Russia on his side. And his father, they had a little business. I think my grandfather was a Gerachosid, I'm not sure. But he came to America twice. Why he did that, I don't know. It would have been better off if he'd have come the first time and stayed and brought his family the first time, because that was in 1899. My father was born in 1895. And he was the 5th of 7 children. His father, they had sewing machines in the house, and they used to manufacture stockings and things, dish towels, I don't know what it was. And he used to take it across the border into Austria, where he could get higher prices for it. Only he neglected to pay the duty. Of course, nobody was loyal to the Tsar, you have to understand that. And they found out about him, and they issued a warrant for his arrest, and he heard about it first. And in those days, the Russian passports did not have pictures in them. He literally grabbed his cousin, one of the Schlissels, he grabbed his cousin's passport, and he got to the United States ultimately, and he was here for 5 years. He saved up a lot of money under those days, and he went back to Poland, to Russia, the Tsarist Russia, and he was living there quietly, and they didn't remember the warrant that was out for his arrest. In 1908 or 9, the Tsarina had a baby. This is the Rasputin story, and they gave amnesty. Foolishly, my grandfather decided he wanted to be here kosher in the country, so he applied for the amnesty. So they gave him, instead of 18 months, they gave him 12. That's what happened. But it wasn't a prison, it wasn't the gulag or anything like that. It was like a county jail. Oh, I see. And their house was about a block and a half away. I've been to Sandomierz. It's a beautiful little city. And my father, he wouldn't eat the prison food because it wasn't kosher. So my father had a job of coming every day with a basket of food for him. And he could walk around in the square, but he had to stay there overnight. And when they got out, he wasn't allowed to live on the border anymore. But there was a depression around, and they moved to Lodz. But there was a depression in the whole world at that time, and he decided to come back to the United States. So his older 3 siblings were already married, and he had an older sister who probably felt that she should have gone with her father, but there was no chance that my grandfather, who was somewhat of a male chauvinist, was going to come with a daughter. He was going to come with a son. And anyway, my father was a very good scholar. He was a good student, although he wasn't religious later on. So they came to Canada first, and again, he was living in Canada for about 3 years, and because he arrived in 1913. And in 1916 or 17, he came to Detroit because there were jobs here because of the First World War effort. And he met my mother here. He told me a story that shows you what the immigrants had to go through. He got a job when he came in Canada. He got a job. It must have been in August or September. And it turned out that Rosh Hashanah was shortly after that, so he took 2 days off. Then he took off a day for Yom Kippur. Then he took 2 days off for the beginning of Sukkot, 2 days off for the end of Sukkot. And the end of the story was they fired him. He said to himself, enough of this nonsense. He was never religious thereafter. Although we kept kosher in our house because later on my grandmother, my mother's mother, lived with us. And so out of respect for her, they kept kosher. But my parents met each other. They were, in those days it was unusual, they were Zionists. We were secular in our family. My father, on the other hand, was very well educated in Jewish matters, not university education. He knew the Tanakh by heart. I tested him once, and I know that that's true. And but they were not religious. They were really secular. And if you mixed up, if you buttered some bread with a fleshik knife, so they cleaned it up and put it back in. They didn't put a stone on it for the heat and bury it and all that sort of stuff. They weren't that way. They were not religious, shall we say, but they were we were a minority in the Jewish community because the family was Zionist, and it was Labor Zionist, not Likud or anything like that. It was Pulitzian. And the rest of their families came over afterwards. One of my father's brothers was killed in the Holocaust with his wife, and a nephew that he had by another sister who died in the flu epidemic in the First World War was killed in the Holocaust also. But my mother's family, all 5 of the siblings came to the United States, and I was very close to those uncles all the time.
Could you tell us your parents' names?
My father's name was Joseph, or Yosef, and my mother's name was Bertha, but everybody called her Bessie. My mother's mother was the one that, she came after the First World War. She came around 1923 with my youngest uncle, the only one that came on a visa. The others came, all you had to do is get through Ellis Island and you were in. That's how they got here.
You mentioned David Oradok, and I know there's a very strong society here. Did you ever go back to that community?
Yes, I was in David Oradok and in Sandomierz in 98. I went with my daughter Laura. The David Oradok Society organized a trip, and I remember Asher Tilshon said to us we had to get at least 30 people to go, otherwise there wouldn't be a trip. And 16 of the 30 were my family. Oh my. I got all of my cousins, not all of my cousins, but a good number of my cousins to go. And some of them took their children. It was, you might know some of them. Lita Zemmel was one, and her son and daughter came, Miriam and Johnny. And Laura came, but my other 3 kids did not come. We were going to go back a second time. Zvi Gilman ran the trip. He was a wonderful lecturer, and he knew a lot about the country. The countries, I should say. And we were going to go a second time, but my wife got very sick, and we had to cancel it. But it would have been a great, because I had all 4 that were going to go on that trip. Oh, we couldn't go.
So what was your experience seeing the village?
The Sandomierz, my father's town, was a very lovely town. It was a cathedral town. It really a walled city, a beautiful city. And we went through the cathedral, which I'm sure my father never went into. We went through the cathedral. There was even a painting on the wall at the cathedral, which was rather anti-Semitic. It showed what was obviously a Jewish man has his hand on the head of a small child. And it was obvious that it had to do with the blood libel. I couldn't talk to anybody in the church to ask them because they didn't speak English. And they didn't. I speak some German, and nobody could speak, so I never found out. But it was obvious to me that it was an anti-Semitic painting. My mother's town was nondescript. It's in the middle of the Pripyat marshes. And when I used to talk to my uncles in particular, I would say, what did you think of, remember of Horodok? And the answer was always the blotte, the mud, the mud. The Pripyat marshes was horrible. And it was really a nondescript town. But it had a large presence in Detroit. I guess what happened was some people came here, they got jobs, sent for the cousins, sent for the uncles, and we have a large, my mother was not a member of the Horodux Society, but after I went on the trip, I joined.
What did her family do in that village?
In that village, my grandfather was a butcher. In fact, their name is Schechter, which means butcher, of course, in Hebrew. And they were involved in that. And my father's family, as I said, they made sewing machines, stockings and dish towels and things like that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how your parents met?
I don't know too much about it, except that I think that they met at some sort of a Labor Zionist meeting. It could have been a Farband meeting also. They were the Farband and the Labor Zionists were all one grouping. They met, I think, probably around 1919, 1920, something like that. And they got married in 1922, and I was born, I'm the oldest of, we were 4 children, but my number 3 was myself. I had a brother, Sidney, who died 2 years ago in 2011. He was an OBGYN. Then I had another brother who died at the age of 6.5. He died of leukemia. And then I have a sister who lives in New York. She's a judge in New York. She has to retire this year. She reached the mandatory retirement age. So at any rate, my grandfather, on my father's father, as I said, my father and my grandfather were here in the United States after 1917 when they moved from Canada. And the rest of my family, my father's family, came over after. Each one has a story, of course, but they came over after the First World War. My grandmother died in 1928, and my grandfather, who must have been quite a character, I'll put it that way, moved from Detroit. He went to Israel, was then in Palestine, and he lived in Mea Shearim. He was religious. My father wasn't, but they got along all right, because his father recognized that he was learned, let's put it that way, but not in a formal sense. He went to a Beis Medrash, not to a yeshiva, but he was trained to be a Balkora in the old country, but as I say, he got away from religion altogether. We went to shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but that was about it. Somebody had a bar mitzvah, maybe I would go then, but that was about it.
Did anyone else in your family travel to Palestine in those days?
In those days, just my grandfather. He moved in 1929 after his wife died. When he was there, he remarried twice. The second wife was the one that survived him. And he was buried on Mount Har Hazeisim, Mount of Olives. But we don't know where his grave is, because when the Jordanians had control of that part of what is now Jerusalem, they took the headstones of they took them and used it for paving blocks.
Desecrated.
We don't know where he was buried, but we know he's buried on Mount of Olives.
And it sounds like you had a wonderful early childhood.
Well, I had a happy childhood. I got to say that. I liked my dad very much. He was an outgoing guy. My mother was a little bit more reserved and I wouldn't say depressed, but there was an element of that in it. But my father was very outgoing, especially after my brother died when I was 6. It was a terrible thing. And in fact, that leukemia unfortunately runs, I think, in my family, not my wife's. Because I have a grandson we have 4 children. And number 3 is my son Stephen, who lives in Seattle. his oldest child died also of leukemia at the age of 2.5. And he has now 3 children. But the oldest of those 3, my daughter-in-law was pregnant with the first one when the older brother died. So none of the 3 children that are living knew the one that died. It was one of those things. But that's the way it goes, I guess. There's nothing much we can do about that.
So let's go back to your early childhood. Where were you educated? What neighborhood did you live in?
We lived in the Dexter area. When I was born, we still lived in the Oakland Avenue section. When the Jewish Center was, the center was on Gladstone and Woodward. But I was only about 6 months old when we moved to the Dexter area. And we lived on in a 4-flat on Dexter and on Boston and McQuaid, just a 4-flat. Then we moved to a Tyler, which was Tyler and Dexter, between Dexter and Homer. And I went to kindergarten from there at McCullough School. Then we moved to, in the same school district, I moved to a 2-flat on Fullerton between Dexter and Wildermere. And then my father was, he bought a house that was on Glendale between Dexter and Homer. It was an area called Russell Woods. Mm-hmm. All new houses went in over there. He must have had one of the first FHA loans under the Roosevelt administration. And we lived in that house until I married Annie. And then when I married Annie, we moved to Huntington Woods. That was in 1954. So from 1937 to 1954, I lived on Dexter. My folks finally sold the house on Glendale in 1959 and moved to Oak Park.
What are some of your remembrances of that neighborhood? I know that it was a colorful place to live.
Well, it was, in those days, a Jewish neighborhood was a Jewish neighborhood. It was completely Jewish. For instance, when I went to Central, I think that something like, we graduated 750 in my class, and I wouldn't be surprised if 700 were Jewish. It happened, there were 40, 50 students there who weren't, and I was rather friendly with the ones that weren't. I knew some of them rather well. The neighborhood, today a neighborhood is considered Jewish if it's only 20% Jewish, like West Bloomfield or Oak Park or something like that. But it was a rather vibrant place. I went to Hebrew school at Tuxedo and Homer. Mr. Chagi was my main teacher. I had other teachers, of course, but he's the one that was, and he knew my father, and that made it very tough for me. He insisted that I speak a conversational Hebrew. They weren't. My father and Mr. Chagi were not very religious people. I've got to tell you that. But they wanted sikha, they used to call it, conversational Hebrew. Not that I know that much, I don't, but I could get along in Israel if I have to on my own. But
so that stuck with you.
We went to, in fact, my bar mitzvah was at the Hebrew school in Tuxedo and Homer, because we didn't belong to any shul. So he arranged to have my bar mitzvah there. I went to McCullough for the first elementary school for the first 6 years, until the 6th grade. And then we went to Durfee, and then we went to Central. Then I went to Wayne University, and then I went to Harvard Law School. And in fact,
so you must have been a good student.
I don't know how good a student I was, but I managed. Let's put it that way. I was going to make a comment. I just heard a couple of hours ago that one of my good friends died, Harold Berry. And his father used to drive. I used to walk over to his house, it was a block away, and his father drove us to Durfee and to Central. He drove us to school, and Getting home was on my own. I can tell you that.
So what kind of interest did you have as a young man?
Depends on what age you're talking about, but I was interested in, I liked history. I always liked history. In fact, I had debated going to get a PhD in European history, either German or Russian, and teaching. But I finally decided to go to law school instead. So I liked the history very much. I liked geography. I wasn't much of a scientist. My mother wanted me to be a doctor. My brother accommodated her, but my sister and I both became lawyers. And I have to tell you that I was interested in politics, always was, history and politics, current events, things like that. I was not a scientist. Biology, chemistry was tough for me. Physics was tough. I didn't really concentrate on those. I really concentrated on geography, on history, and things of that sort.
Well, you mentioned that your family was very Zionist. Were you involved in any youth organizations when you were a youngster?
Yes, you'll be surprised because you think of me as different now. But I was a member of HaShomer HaTzair, which was a pretty left-wing organization. I remember that I was the youngest one in my class, in Mr. Chagi's Hebrew school class, and most of my friends were about 3 years older than me. So people are rather surprised when I tell them that Bill Schumer, I don't know if you knew him, was in my class. David Mondry was in my class. Two of the members of my class made Aliyah in the 40s. I don't know what their Hebraicized names were, but Tzvi Festerstein was one, and Ben Kutnik, as I remember, who was a veterinarian, also made Aliyah from a long time ago. And they lived, of all places, in a HaShomer HaTzair kibbutz, Ein HaShofet, or was it Ein Dor, one of the two. I think it was Ein HaShofet, which is named after Louis Brandeis. So we were very much involved in, we were a minority in the Jewish community by being Zionist.
Did you ever give any thought to making Aliyah?
Yes and no, but never seriously, because by the time I went to law school already, I knew I couldn't practice over there. Although one of my friends did go to Israel and became a lawyer there. His name was Ben Barish, as I remember it. He became a lawyer in Israel. I don't even know if he's still living or not. I can't tell you. I lost track of him.
I'm interested in your career at Harvard. What brought you to Harvard?
I had, when I graduated Wayne, I was accepted at the University of Michigan Law School. And this is a story like my father. I said to him, why don't I have an acceptance at Michigan, so I know I'm in a good school. There's no problem there. So I said, but you know, maybe it would be easier for me if I were one of the very few who practice in Michigan from Harvard. As it turned out, so he said, stick the iron in the fire. He said, make the application. And I think, I do not know this, but it's an instinct that I have. I believe that they asked me, they didn't know, they had no experience. They told me when I applied that they had no experience with anybody from Wayne, and would I please take the graduate, then there was no LSAT in those days, law school aptitude test. Would I take the graduate record exam so I would compare, they could compare me to other Ivy League schools. And I said, yeah, because I wasn't worried if I didn't pass, I'd go to Michigan, so I didn't care. So I took it, and they accepted me. I later found out that there were a lot of students, there were a lot of Jewish students at Harvard in the year that I went there. I wouldn't be surprised we were maybe 20-25% of the class. And they had had very, very good experience with those who came from City College of New York, CCNY. And maybe they felt that here was another urban school. Let's see what we can get here. And 3 or 4 people since then have gone, but I was the first one that went there. And it turned out that when I got out of school, I obviously had to find a job. And I think, without knowing, that I was a competitor with another fellow who became a friend of mine later for the same job with Carvel and Igus was the name of the firm. And that I got the job because they wanted to see what a Harvard guy would do. Not that he was law review and I wasn't, but they gave the job to me. And I really got my first job because possibly, and getting an entry-level job is very, very important. You have to get started somehow or other. I had never been in a law office before I graduated.
Oh, really?
Never been in a law office. They didn't have the system that they have now. We don't have in law like an internship for doctors. And there was no real experience. We had a lot of theoretical knowledge, but not very much in the way of real practical experience. Now they give you much more practical experience. They have clinics and things like that, which we didn't have in those days. The class was, as I said, there were a lot of Jewish students in it. There was certainly no bias against Jewish students, at least when I was going. And it was, I had a good time when I was there. There's no question of it. In fact, my second year, I lived in a house with 3 other men. And then one of those men and there were no women at Harvard in those days. The first female showed up in September of '49. I graduated in June '49. And one of the men in my second year became my roommate. We moved into a very nice dorm. It was really a very nice dorm there. And he became my mechutin.
Oh, nice.
His daughter married my son. That's the one that lives in Seattle.
Who is that?
Stephen.
Oh.
Stephen, I guess he wanted to escape from his mother and father, and he decided to move to Seattle. And I remember I said to him, well, do you know anybody in Seattle? He said, no, but he'd been there once when he was ski bumming. So I said, well, I have my old roommate with whom I was in contact a lot. I said, I know that he has a son over there, and you'll need to talk to a doctor, to a dentist, who knows what. At least he can give you some advice. So I said, I'll call him up and we'll set up something. So I called up my roommate, Mort Fine was his name, and I said, I'd like your son's address and telephone number. So he asked why, and I told him that Stephen was going to move there. So I said, I hope he doesn't bother your son too much because your son is married and has a child, I think at that time. He said, don't worry about that. He says, I also have 2 unmarried daughters there, and it took with one of them. He married one.
What a nice story.
Yeah, it's a very, it was a rather warm wedding in Philadelphia when they got married. Because Mort lived in Philadelphia and his daughters had moved out because of his son. They moved out to Seattle. But unfortunately, he has passed away already. But his widow is still living, and obviously we see her when we go out to Seattle to see the son's children.
Let's go back a little. Tell us about how you met Ann.
Actually, Ann met me.
Oh,
she won't admit it, but that's what happened. Apparently, she had heard from one of her girlfriends about me. I was at that time the chairman of the young adult division. They called it its junior division. Avern Cohn was my predecessor, and Milt Luco was my successor, as I remember it. And so I had gotten active in Federation because my boss, Sid Carble, when I first started to work over there, and I only worked there about 16 months, when he said, go down to Federation, you should get involved. He was really my mentor when it came to this. He was a wonderful person. I still see his son, Bobby Carble. I don't know if you know him or not. But I was working for them, And he said, you should get yourself involved in Jewish matters. And he suggested federation. So I went down. I didn't know what federation was. I knew from the Polizeian. I didn't know anything from the Histadrut. I knew, but I didn't know anything about this. We were, as I said, my father had voted twice for Norman Thomas, who was the socialist candidate for president, 28 and 32. And he was also in 36 and 40. But so he was a socialist. And I didn't, and that's how at any rate, I went down because of Sid Carville, and I went to the Federation. And the next thing I knew, they said somebody volunteered to be in charge of 5 solicitors. So I raised my hand. Next thing I knew, I was getting more, and I think Abram chose me as his successor, if I'm not mistaken. And I chose Milt Luco as my successor. And it was a very, that's how I got started with the Federation. It was back in 1950.
Right after the State of Israel? Oh.
That's when we got started in Federation at that time. And
what were some of the activities that you participated in then?
you mean at Federation?
Yes.
Well, I became ultimately chairman of the junior division, as it was called then. I guess you'd call it Next Generation now or something like that. And then from there I went on to, I remember I got involved, I became a solicitor when we graduated out of the junior division. And my next position was as the Federation, the campaign was organized on trades and professions, and I became the head of the lawyers division, and I had, normally that job should have been 2 years, but the 6-day war broke out at that time, so I got 3 years as a result, and so I was there for a while. Then I was, at a later point, I was the chairman of the Culture and Education Committee. They were combined in those days. Now they're separated. And then I was chairman of the Education Committee. I was president of the United Hebrew Schools. I've been on the Board of Governors. And as I remembered, I was 8 over 80, but I didn't have to do any work for that. And I was, I got the Lifetime Achievement Award. I didn't do anything for that. What?
And Partnership 2000.
Oh, and I was on Partnership 2000. I enjoyed the time on Partnership 2000 quite a bit.
I want to ask you about that, but we have to go back to Anne. How did she
how
did she find you?
Oh, I forgot. I got too much off of the main. She heard about me. Apparently, one of her girlfriends I had gone out with or something of that sort, and she arranged. She met one of her sister was married to Bill Ratner, and Bill had an older brother who was not married yet, and she saw him one day and she said, do you know Norm Katz? And I barely knew him. I very barely knew him. So he said yes, he had met me. And she said, can you fix me up with a date or something like that? And the next thing I knew, he called. And I wasn't in at the time. I was practicing law by this time. And I didn't know who it was, but it said Dr. Ratner. He was a dentist. So I thought, was I involved in some sort of a negligence case or something? I couldn't place him. At any rate, he fixed me up on the first date, and the rest is, they say, history. And he came from a much different background than I did, obviously. I don't think that her family was very socialist.
No. What was her background?
She was Reform. She was Franklin Hills. Really was very different than me. It was, as I've often said, we were two people who were as far apart as you could be, who were still Jewish. She from one extreme on the Reform side, and I from the secular, not from the religious side. And the rest is history. That's all I can tell you. We're now 4 children and 11 grandchildren since then.
So what kind of a home did you and Ann build together in terms of religious experience?
We bought a house. I bought a house just before we got married in Huntington Woods, and we lived there for 6 years and 2 children. Then there were very few lots in Huntington Woods at that time, but we found one on Hendry, and the late Fred Kay built the house for us, and we lived there for 25 years. So we were 6 years in the first house on Boardman, and 25 years on Hendry. And we've been in our present house now 27 years. We're married 59 years already. It'll be 60 years in June. So we've lived in 3 houses, let's put it that way.
And in terms of your children, their religious education, what kind of...
They went to the United Hebrews. There was no Hillel in those days. Although those who live in Detroit, my daughter Laura's 3 children, all went to Hillel, and then they went to Frankel. Now 2 of them are at the University of Michigan, and one is a junior, I guess 11th grader at Frankel, a Jewish academy. And the oldest son, who lives in North Potomac, Maryland, he's a lawyer, and he works for the Farm Credit Administration. He's been there about 20 years. He has 3 children, and they have gone to Hebrew school, but it's synagogue oriented. One of the problems we had when I was president of the Hebrew school was the high school, not enough children were going on to college. Not to college. Not enough children were going on after bar mitzvah to continue. Although I did, because as I said, my father wanted me to be conversational Hebrew. Not that I'm very good at it. I don't use it that much. But on the other hand, one of our problems was how do we retain children? I remember this was a constant problem all the time, and we worked at it. We then got the synagogue affiliations. And when I was going to Hebrew school, the Hebrew schools were separate. There was one at Philadelphia and Byron. There was one at Parkside. There was Tuxedo and Homer, where I went. There was one at Rose City Cone. They were freestanding buildings. But then before I got involved in the Hebrew schools, it had changed to be synagogue schools. And then after they were synagogue schools, we wanted to retain them. We had a Central Hebrew High School, but really didn't retain big numbers considering the numbers that went through to bar mitzvah to go to the Hebrew high school. It didn't really retain a large number of them. We do a better job of Jewish education now through the parochial schools. And I must say that originally I didn't cotton to the idea of having parochial schools. But I have to say today that that is if we're going to retain a Jewish community, we'll have to do it. And I remember thinking to myself, is it too narrow a school? Because only non-Jews. But on the other hand, my high school, as I said, had 750 students who graduated. 700 were Jewish. And I remember when I was in law school, I had a lot of friends who were Catholic. I remember talking with them many times. Many of them were the product of parochial schools, and they had no trouble getting along with the Jewish students. Of course, they were all intelligent people, but we had no trouble. And I've come to the conclusion that if we want to preserve our Jewish identity, I guess we'll have to go for parochial schools. And I must say I have gone to Grandparents' Day at both Hillel and at Frankel, and I am very, very impressed with the quality of the education. Education has always been something I've been very interested in. I realize there are a lot of things that are very important. A center is important, plays are important, Yad Ezra is important, Jark is important, Kadima is important. My interest has always been in education. And I really feel that it's necessary to get that Jewish education, and I think that the parochial school system is going to be the wave of the future. It's already the wave of the present. It'll be the wave of the future for those who go there.
So Laura's your only child that's
in
remained
Detroit.
in Detroit.
In Detroit. The other three wanted to get away from their parents, and I always say that we were lousy parents. We chased them away. My wife, who's a clinical psychologist, said, why don't you say that we raised them to be independent,
Exactly.
that we took them up on it and we let them go, and that that's the way it was. I said, sounds very good to tell people, but we chased them away.
I'm sure you didn't. Not what I hear about you from Laura. But,
well, I agree. We do see. I often wondered that when Annie and I are off the scene, we make an effort, of course, to have them get together periodically, go on vacations together or something like that. What's going to be in the future, I can't tell you, but we'll be in 4 different centers.
You've laid the seeds for that kind of a relationship.
Pardon?
You have set the pattern for that kind of relationship
Yes,
with your children.
all the grandchildren as cousins know each other. There's no question about that. Whether they will be able to continue that when they get married, none of them are married yet, although they have run in age from 16 to 26 today, 2013. But none are yet married. But when they will, they'll each branch off and go off in their own direction, as my children have done. Although they live in 4 cities, they still stay in touch. Some are closer than others, relationships. But you know, when major things happen, we get together. There's no question about it. We try and get them to. One of the things that has worked very much for family cohesion has been skiing. It sounds strange. I'm not much of an athlete, but I really love the skiing part, and that's they all wanted to go skiing with the father and mother. You know? So
Brought them together.
It was togetherness.
Yeah, whatever works.
Whatever works, that's what you do.
So I know you've had a lot of roles in this community, and you mentioned Partnership 2000. Were you the chair of?
No, I wasn't the chair. I was just a member of it. I was on it for 2 years. Made some friends over there. There was one thing that I was really very pleased about that we had something to do with. Partnership 2000 has a relationship with 3 communities, Nazareth Elite, Mishmar HaEmek, and Migdal HaEmek, and Emek Yisrael. There is a place in, I think it's Emek Yisrael, it's called Tower Electronics, which is a very large company. It's on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange. And I think, I'm not sure of that. And they made a deal with Toshiba of Japan. And they greatly expanded it. It was a big plant when I visited the first time. It was twice the size when I visited the second time. And they needed to get workers. But since the Japanese don't speak Hebrew, Jews don't study Japanese, they study English. So English was going to be the language of the company when they wanted to communicate with one another. And that was the days when we were getting a lot of immigrants from the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. There were even some from Ethiopia were coming in, and they wanted to change demographically the Galil HaTachton, the Lower Galilee. And here were job opportunities now. And I remember, if I remember this thing correctly, I talked to Bob Aronson, and I said, why don't we teach the Russian immigrants who are highly educated and we can teach even the Ethiopians who will have the less educated jobs enough English so they can work over there. And we did do that. And it turned out that we were going to make arrangements at a high school, a technical high school in Nazareth Elite, where they could do this thing. And I was talking to a by the name of, his name is, I've forgotten his name. It's 20 years ago.
An Israeli?
He was the human resources person at Tower Electronics. Tower is a translation of Migdal. Migdal means tower. Migdal Emek. So at any rate, he said, you don't have to go to the high school. He says, we have facilities here. If you'll pay for the cost of the, I think if my memory is correct, I talked to Bob Aronson about it that time, and we did do some educating for those who didn't speak English, although the Russians were very well educated when they came to Israel. And it was an easy transition for them. The Ethiopians was a little tougher, and they had less, but I remember talking to, his name was Shalom, I can't remember his first name, the head of human resources there. I don't know if he's still living or not, but he said that he needed to get some PhDs, so he went to Argentina. Those were the days of the dictatorship in Argentina. It was relatively easy to get them out. And he said I could give them 5-year work permits, but he couldn't get enough, and he finally wound up in India. He got it, but those people, they needed the help, but they gave 1-year visas. They wanted Jews to come. That's basically it. And I was very proud of the fact that the Operation 2000, Partnership 2000, did this. I don't know how, if they'd have gotten the jobs anyway, but we made it easier for them. Let's put it that way. And I was very pleased with that result.
There really there was so much cooperation between this.
Yes.
Detroit and their
and
area.
Nowadays, it's a little different. I understand more of the students are coming from Israel. They're going to the Camp Tamarack. They're going to schools here, which is very nice. But I think the Partnership 2000 is good non-educational, if I can put it that way.
Really built bridges between
It built bridges. It was an educational process. They get to know us, and we get to know them. And all of life is learning on the job. It's really basically what it is. It works out.
So you've had a lot of involvement in our Jewish community. Have you been involved in other organizations in the general community as well?
Yeah. Actually, there was one item which you'll be surprised about. One day, my second son, the one who lives in Seattle, Stephen, came home from school. He was 9 years old at the time, and he said that the YMCA had come to the school and wanted to recruit kids with their fathers to belong to the Indian Guides. Cub Scouts are mother-son. This would be father-son, and they wanted to encourage a father-son relationship. So, and he said to me, why don't you go over? Okay, well, I'll go over to it. So we had a tribe in Huntington Woods. They were all Jewish guys. We knew one another. We weren't exactly gung-ho guys to tie knots and things like that, or to make wampum belts or whatever it was. But we got involved in it, and every one of the tribes had to send a delegate to a central at the YMCA. So I went to the YMCA. I was appointed the delegate for our tribe. And some of those guys were really gung-ho. You had to see them. They took this much more seriously than we did. At any rate, I went to those meetings, and we'd go to the meetings, and they would spend inordinate amounts of time on nonsense. Should we charge for a hot dog $2 or $2.50 when we're at Camp Oiesa, which was the YMCA camp? And I used to I wanted to go home already. So I remember saying many times, I would say, you know what? We don't have to keep discussing this. Said everything there is to say. let's take a boat, 2 or 2.5. Well, let's get it over with and we'll go home. So at any rate, I would take the lead on these sorts of things. And to my great surprise, one day, the social worker who was appointed, it was a big group. There were, I think, 500 kids and 500 parents, fathers. Mm. And he came over to me and he said, would you, the social, and my predecessor said, would you run be the chief of the whole thing? Mm. So I said, what do you want a Jewish chief for? No, don't worry about it. I thought I couldn't possibly win. So I said, okay, put my name up. And I won hands down because I guess they all knew me because I was always pushing things along. Invariably, I couldn't go home anyway, even when we did this thing, because they all wanted to go out and have a beer afterwards. And I'm not much of a drinker, I've got to tell you. But I became the chief of the Indian guys at the YMCA. But I didn't stay active after I finished my stint. Maybe I should have, because I was always interested in politics. Possibly, if I'd have been involved with there, I might have gone on to elective office, but I was having too much fun practicing with my partner. So I didn't do that. But I have a picture at home with me in an Indian headdress, and the headdress goes down my back all the way to my ankles. And I remember Annie is a little bit more culturally inclined than I am. And in those days, the Metropolitan Opera used to come to Detroit at the Masonic Temple. And so I went with her. It was a black tie affair. And I still remember this. We got out of the car, and they had a red carpet. And we walked up the red carpet, and somebody took a picture of us. It showed up in the Detroit News or Free Press, I can't remember which. And all of a sudden, at the YMCA was posted a picture of me in the headdress, next to a picture of me. Look at our chief.
How elegant you were.
See what kind of guy we got here as a chief. Goes to the opera. Those guys didn't go to the opera very much. But I was active there for several years, I'd say about 3-4 years. And
were you involved in the Detroit Historical Commission at
one
time?
Oh, yes, I forgot about that. Roman Gribbs, rather, Ray we called him, appointed me to the Detroit Historical Commission. And I enjoyed that work, but about 9-10 months later, he asked me, he said, I owe somebody a favor. He said, would you mind if you resigned?
Oh.
I can give it to this. I said, sure, Ray. No problem. And I resigned. But I was on the Detroit Historical Commission for a short period of time, for about 9-10 months, something like that. And I've tried to think of the other things of that sort. Most of my activity has been with the Jewish community.
What are some of the major issues that you've seen during your lifespan in the Jewish community?
Well, I remember the discussion whether we should have parochial schools versus go to public schools, and in the afternoon get your supplement like I had done. That was one of them. I remember we had some social issues. I'm looking at the pictures of the heads. I knew, I didn't know Sobolov well. I knew who he was. Bill Ronan I knew. Sal Drockler I knew. Sal I knew personally, on a personal basis. His father-in-law and my father, his father-in-law was Michael Michlem, who was a Hebrew school teacher, and he and my father were very close friends. Mike Zeltzer I knew very well. We happened to be in the same building, and I was at that time, I think I was president of the Hebrew schools, and if I had to find out something, I just went upstairs, and I could always get in there. I could always talk with him. And I know Bob Aronson. The other two, between Mike and Bob, I didn't know that well, but I knew them. But that's about it. I remember the big problem was the need for funding all these things. Well, that's right. That's another thing that I was. I was the chairman of the campaign in 92 and 3, I think it was. And I remember in those days we raised, I think it was $31 million. One of the things I was constantly talking about with David Page, who appointed me, and with Mike Zeltzer and a few others, was we got 2/3 of our money. If we raised, let's say, 33 million, I think $30 million, let's talk 30. We got 20 of the $30 million from 500 givers. Mm-hmm. And we got 10 million from, in those days, 16,000 givers. And I remember saying, we've got to broaden this base. The 500, of course, there's always new 500. Somebody dies and somebody else comes up. But it was a constant problem of getting, how do you get the people to, it's a process, it's not an event. Mm-hmm. You get people in and you start them off. I remember Gelly once told me, that's Alan Gelfand, told me that somebody that who had been only a $100 giver left his estate for $300,000 to the Federation. His family didn't need it, and this is what he wanted to do. So you never know, great oaks from little acorns grow. How do you get people involved? And the big question was, how do you educate people to give? It doesn't happen overnight, because I remember the first time when Sid Carpel sent me down to Federation. I think my first donation was $10, because I didn't earn very much in those days either. But ultimately, before the current problem arose economically, I was giving substantially more than that. But it was a process. I slowly built up to it. How do you do that? That was one of the big things that we were constantly worrying about. How do you get people to send their children for education? I was always involved in the education part. I wasn't very much involved with the center or the, although we donated to the center when it was built. How do you involve people? How do you get them to be involved? Because once you're involved, it becomes routine for you. You just simply do it. There's an old saying that if you have something you want done, get a busy person to do it. And it's very necessary, there's no doubt about it. I would say the most important thing of all would be getting people involved. How do you do it? And you never know where it's going to come from. I would never have dreamt when I was a youngster, and all I knew about it was the Histadrut. I didn't know anything about the Federation at all. It was Sid Carpel, who was my mentor, who said, get involved. This is a much broader basis, and it includes everybody. It includes Zionists, it includes Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. They're all there. It's a big tent, let's put it that way, but you have to get people active, and how you do it, I don't know. I can't tell you.
Have you been following the young adult movement currently
I
to see
haven't
what they're
followed
doing?
it too much. I remember I was invited once, about 3-4 years ago, to a reunion, and I was so far the oldest one there. There's no sense in it. But I remember one of my friends said, "You were the chairman in 1954."
That's a long time.
Long time ago. 60 years or more.
So you've told us your message and how you feel that education is so important. Are there any other words that you'd really like to leave us with before we end our...
Yes,
yeah.
I don't know how you do it, but you have to involve people. You can't be bashful, but sometimes it's a matter of asking. Some people will do something. Some you have to ask twice maybe, but you have to show that you really want them to do it. I've always, and I know that all these things are important, but I've always felt that education was the key to the future. I know that my family jumped into the middle classes in one generation. Mm-hmm. And the reason was we became professionals in my case. My sister, my brother, and I. The education, I think, is the key to the thing, to everything, and your life is so much richer and so much more fulfilling if you are educated. I am currently teaching, and this will be rather interesting. I'm teaching English as a second language. I signed up with the Oakland Literacy Council, and by serendipity, they assigned me. I thought I would get an inner city person who wants to upgrade, or I would get a Latino who wants to learn English as a second language. To my great shock and surprise, but he could be a personal friend, I received a Syrian doctor who is 68 years old as my student, and he's a Christian, not a Muslim. And I've learned an awful lot about Syria, and he's really an outstanding person. And I've learned about, and he has learned about us. I have learned about him, and I find that very fulfilling now. Of course, I'm now retired, so I want to do something with my time, so this is what I'm doing. I'm also going to school. Just this last semester, I took a course at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. The semester before, I took a course at Oakland University. I took 2 courses, in fact. And in fact, the first course I took at Oakland University was taught by my late partner's daughter-in-law. Oh. Maybe you know her. Do you know Kelly Victor? Oh, yeah. David Victor is the wife. David and I are in the same office. And I've always, it keeps the brain going, let's put it that way. Education, to me, you've got to be doing something, otherwise you'll wither away on the vine. It won't do. I would put a lot of emphasis, of course this has always been a Jewish emphasis, is study and education. You don't have to be a genius at it, you just have to be interested. It'll make all the difference in the world.
Thank you, Norm. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Is there anything that we missed?
Well, as I said, I'm prejudiced in favor of education. I would put a lot of money and effort and into the school system. And there's the old saying that the Jesuits said, "You give me the child and I'll give you the man." And I should say the adult. I don't want to be a sexist. But I really feel that education is the key to progress. It's the key to understanding and knowledge. And it probably is what differentiates the Jewish community from many of the other communities around here. And I really feel strongly about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Very nice seeing you.